The first speaker is Linda Mann. And again, the topic today is fascist ideas on the left, past, present, and what to do about it. Last week, John Ryman covered the theoretical roots and the history. And today, Linda and Megan are going to be talking about who are the main players in this contemporary process. How do you spot it? What are some of the solutions? So Linda Mann is a lifelong socialist, an anarchist, and an anti-fascist. That's Linda. Meghan Keane is an artist, critic, and intersectional feminist anti-fascist. She is involved in refugee and solidarity work on multiple continents, including #Free Syria. So Linda, you want to go ahead?
Okay, well, I don't know if my colleagues in Antifa would consider me an anarchist, but I have been involved in the anti-fascist movement for about 5 years now. Over the past decade, the US and European left have found themselves in a major existential crisis. Fascist rule has become a realistic possibility. We are now witnessing a realignment of the left in regard to international issues. Major parts of the Marxist-based left, plus other groups like the Green Party and other various peace groups, are now moving towards accommodating a red-brown configuration that's being promoted by one of the world's imperialist powers, i.e. Russia. In effect, what we are seeing is a massive purge of the left. And it's
Linda, can you slow down a little bit? It's hard to follow you. It's okay. Take your time.
I practice slowing down, but
okay, it's all right. Take your time. Take your time. We're listening.
That major parts of the left, including various groups that normally are not in communication, like the Marxist left, the Green Party, and various peace groups, are accommodating a red-brown configuration that's being promoted by one of the world's imperialist powers, i.e. Russia. In effect, we are seeing a massive purge of the left that is not being carried out by some egotistical leader or faction, but by the merciless material realities of our times. These realities are being generated by Russia with its destruction of Syria and Ukraine. Their intervention in the last decade in Libya, Mali, and the Central African Republic. Finally, they have provided propaganda and material support in the US and Europe for fascist and religious fundamentalist groups. But the most important of these realities is that parts of the left are susceptible. Well, I mean, the destruction of those countries obviously is more important, but theoretically, the most important, in the realm of theory, the most important part of these realities is that major parts of the left are susceptible to fascist collaboration. For the most part, actual collaboration between the left and the fascists have not occurred in this country, at least. However, years of weak analysis on our part in opportunism towards the ruling class have been exploited by elements that have hobbled the unions and activist groups on the left for decades, and they are moving us in that direction. The current fight on the left is fundamentally about the status of victims of Russian imperialism and whether they deserve, or whether they are autonomous actors and whether they deserve the right to resist. The two most prominent of these are Syrians and Ukrainians. There are others, such as Uyghurs, who are oppressed by Chinese colonialism. This fight appears at first blush to be exclusively a Marxist-Leninist affair, but now even non-Marxist groups have gotten involved. That said, as John's presentation last week showed, a lot of the unfinished business of the ML left, or Marxist-Leninist left, is indeed at the center of arguments over imperialist actors other than the US. Much of this unfinished business concerns terminology and formulations that first appeared 100 years ago and in response to World War I and have not undergone extensive development since. The theoretical stagnation is mainly due to the abandonment of a revolutionary class struggle by the left in developed first world countries, both as regards their own societies and also other actors on, in the anti-colonial movement. The story of this abandonment set forth by John last week provides the backdrop for the confusion we are facing now. It's important to state that our problem today transcends these old concepts of imperialism. They're now suddenly relevant in new and unexpected ways. Capitalists and imperialists see class consciousness as the main threat, and China and Russia are no different. According to Michael Karachis, geopolitics has replaced class consciousness for many on the left. And this is also the center of is also the basis of the debate between them and principled internationalists. Domestically, these groups have largely excellent positions, leftist positions on U.S. economies, economics, U.S. racism, U.S. feminism, and LGBTQ rights, even though they rely entirely on reformism to bring them about. But internationally, U.S. leftists have become mouthpieces for Russian and Chinese imperialism, or for subsidiary powers such as Iran or Syria. This degeneration on the international issues has led to Campism, which dates back to the Bolshevik Revolution and was a division between those who supported that revolution and those who didn't. Campism has ossified as the Soviet Union first degenerated and then later collapsed and reverted to capitalism and became the Russian Federation. Campism is part of the opportunism that is rampant now on the left. And the apologetics occasioned by opportunism are no longer confined to acts by Russia or China. Now the left will cape any authoritarian state or group that presents itself as left, such as Venezuela or Nicaragua. But it will also do repressive non-left regimes like Iran and Syria, who make no pretense of being interested in human rights or equality. These states merely have to position themselves as opponents of US imperialism, even as they align with Russia. The best definition of Campism is an abandonment of principle, whereby the ethics of a behavior is dependent on who is doing it and not on the content of the behavior or its class basis. Campists extend solidarity to a state, not to a people. For Campists, the validity of supporting a certain state necessitates the victory of that state. Victory is a priority because it is the only way to legitimize their position and the atrocities committed in its name. And we see this now in a lot of the debate on Twitter. We've gone from arguing old concepts of imperialism with these folks to whether or not one side or the other is winning. And those have been the fiercest debates I've seen, as a personal anecdote. And it's really quite clear to these people that the theoretical stuff is secondary. It's the victory that matters. Now that there's a chance of Russia losing this war on Ukraine, the whole infrastructure of Campism is at risk. And not only as regards Ukraine, but Syria as well. It means a reckoning is at hand for the left's abandonment of these victims of Russian genocide, and is frankly almost a decade overdue. Lately, it's worth noting, there have been important discussions both in the capitalist media and alternative media about Chechens and Georgians and the people of Libya, Mali, and Central African Republic. These discussions are a direct result of the aggressive campaign in Ukraine, and were largely ignored before that. There are a lot of positions for this political tendency that I'm trying to describe. Red, brown, Nazgul, or third positionists. These labels, however, refer to fascist history. Nazguls, or Nazguls, as some of us call them, refers to the National Bolshevik Party in Russia, whose founding membership includes Alexander Dugin, a fascist and close advisor to Putin, and who John described more fully in his talk last week. In the case of the third positionists, that describes the so-called left wing of the Nazi Party, or Strasserites, also known as the SA of the Nazi Party, or Francis Parker Yockey after World War II. Currently, third positionists are represented by the defunct Traditionalist Workers' Party, or the 3% militia. These groups believe they are in a third way between capitalism and socialism, but they are not in general in alliance with the left. They are fascists that have adopted some of the demands of the left, usually economic, where they critique capitalism, but anti-Semitically counterpose, quote, producer capitalists, i.e. the manufacturing or agricultural sector, against the evil capitalists or the Jewish financiers. Only in a few instances do we see an outright alliance between fascists and people calling themselves leftists. We've unfortunately seen the beginning of one such blatant alliance. That was the participation of UNAC, the International Action Committee, a Workers' World Front group, in the Black Agenda report with the openly fascist Dugin-led theory conference in 2014 in Moscow. And also present at that was the League of the South. Today, Caleb Maupin of the Workers' World Party is leading an effort to actually fuse with fascists and is a supporter of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What we are seeing, an open supporter too, not a covert supporter like some of these other sneaky people, that keep trying to both sides the issue. What we are seeing is something unique. It's like a second COINTELPRO launched against the left, but by a foreign power with its own imperial interests and a system of capitalist exploitation. A provisional label of, quote, RT left, unquote, could be applied to this political biosphere of historically left organizations, individual influencers like Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal, and websites not attached to any organization. When I say RT left, I am referring to the folks on the left whose political alignment is in lockstep with the RT media family. RT, or Russia Today, is the Russian Federation popular state-funded media family that produces self-interested content in 6 languages: English, Arabic, Spanish, and French, German, and Russian, along with a sister org, RUPTLY. The groups and people that make up this, quote, RT left, unquote, tendency span the left, include many Leninist parties, which also include all the Maoist, Stalinist, and Trotskyist parties, the Green Party, and pacifist anti-war groups. Many of the groups and people in the peace movement have been involved as such since dating back to the Iraq War. Normally, these folks would have little in common and very little communication, but now we are seeing lockstep talking point unity. It's also media outlets and websites who are sadly now part of
Linda,
yeah, I'm sorry,
okay.
my phone started doing something.
Okay.
There are now also media outlets and websites that are now sadly part of the RT left political blogospheres by virtue of being by virtue of their position being in open alignment with the Russian state media. One of the first was globalresearch.org. This site was so prolific, a disinformation tracking site by Andrew Weisberg, which was tracking all of the pro-Russian media propaganda around Ukraine in 2014, discovered that all of the media spouting pro-Russian lines were using global research as a source. It's possible that all of this began with the 2011 Arab Spring or sooner. RT began broadcasting in the US in 2010. But Syrian activists and folks in solidarity with the Syrian revolution are in a fair degree of consensus that the propaganda effort against Syrians exploded after the chemical weapons gassing of the Damascus suburb Ghouta in August of 2013. There was an attempt by Mint Press to blame the rebel opposition to Assad for the gassing, when it was clear to the experts that it was the Syrian government. This attempt by deception was an international sensation and brought a lot of attention to Mint Press and the pro-Assad sentiment on the left. The main center of debate between principled internationalists and the RT left is over imperialism, but there's a second, less fought over domain, which is gaining ground and could be as important. This is the fascism that is worming its way into most bourgeois and liberal democracies and the former BRICS, meaning Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Russia, one of the BRICS, is its main sponsor and supporter. In many liberal democratic countries like the US, France, and Italy, and Hungary, which has is no longer a liberal democracy. These states have major parties that are pro-Russian, or in many states like the US, Hungary, Brazil, and India, fascists hold and have held state power. There needs to be a thorough analysis of why all these first and second tier capitalist powers are leaning towards fascism. But that's beyond the scope of this discussion, and certainly nothing we can expect the RT left to sincerely take up or explain. In fact, they are notable for not acknowledging the existence of fascism, except in Ukraine, because that's where Russia says that they are. And there are fascists there, just like in every other country in the developed world. But Russian propaganda only labels fascists as those who put up the most resistance, such as the Azov Brigade, which is a particular bugaboo of the RT left. To quote Michael Coburn of Bellingcat, who is the author of The Azov Movement, which is a book not only about that, but the far-right movements in Eastern Europe, quote, there's generally a split on the global far right as to how the Azov movement is seen. And at its core, it comes down to not how they see Ukraine, but Russia, end quote. This quote could easily be applied to the RT left. Not recognizing fascism is a major departure for leftists. An important task of the left for the past century has been to guard against fascism. It's a fair question whether someone who refuses to see an obvious visible threat, fascist threat, much less fight it, is really a leftist. In view of the view of both the global far right and the RT left of the Azov movement could be due to the fact that most fascist groups receive some kind of support from Russia, as well as fundamentalist Christian groups. Russia itself has many fascist groups and uses a mercenary far right brigade, the Wagner Group, to commit atrocities in Libya, Mali, and the Central African Republic, Syria, and Ukraine. This Wagner Group came together in 2014, which coincides with the Russian annexation of Crimea and Europe, plus the takeover of those two, the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, and the Euromaidan uprising against the Russian-controlled president of Ukraine, and his expulsion and overthrow. Wagner has been in Syria since 2015. What makes Ukraine ambiguous is that their far right is nationalistic, as are all the groups, fascist groups. But presently, the people of Ukraine and their nation are waging a national liberation struggle against Russian imperialism. This doesn't make their far right any nicer or better than anyone else's, but it doesn't change the equation by which we support Ukraine's anti-imperial struggle. As the US and other countries confront a fascist threat, who's left to fight against it if the campus left refuses to do so? Antifa is a dispersed, largely anarcho-syndicalist movement made up of many autonomous groups that meet the fascists in the streets and prevent them from having a platform or terrorizing other marginalized groups. Terrorizing structurally marginalized groups. They do extensive research on the groups and the people, which helped lead to the identification of many January 6th insurrectionists. Because they receive little or no support from the rest of the left and are despised by the RT left, they're often in groups of a dozen or a couple hundred of anti-fascists against large groups of armed fascists with automatic weapons who are supported by law enforcement. Several anti-fascists have died or been injured by fascists and law enforcement. There's also been physical violence by fascists that could have been stopped or prevented if more people had been mobilized against this very threat. And fascists are very fearful of large crowds. They're very unhappy when, if they're outnumbered anyway, and the police that are present at these things tend to do less obvious support of the fascists. They tend to be a lot less blatant in their support.
Linda, I just want to give you a time note. Yeah, you're coming up to 20 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. In conclusion, even if we're unable to stop the flow of disinformation by the RT left, we have an obligation to debunk it and call their bluff wherever we run into it online or in real life. Also, we can and should do something about the fascist threat in our own country. Anyone who is a real socialist or sincere in their politics of justice and liberation should join or support the anti-fascist movement, regardless of their political affiliation. Okay, I'm done. Sorry
Oh,
about that.
no, that was perfect. Yeah, that's great.
Well,
Really,
wasn't quite
thank you very much, Linda. Thank you. I've been asked to read a statement by an activist who wasn't able to speak. As a longtime activist, I've never seen so many of my friends confused about world events. The online disinformation and the pro-Putin stance of left leaders has influenced many people. The individuals and organizations that are aligned with Putin have extensive online disinformation that supports their political line. In the past, you knew the political orientation of parties' newspapers, the militant or the socialist worker or the revolutionary worker, etc. Now there are many online media sites that claim to be independent but aren't. They are aligned with Putin, Assad, and Iran. Some of my friends have just followed the left leadership and accepted the analysis that Syria was a US regime change operation, and that the Maidan revolution in Ukraine was a CIA operation, that actual separatists in Ukraine fought to break from Ukraine and be under Russian rule, that Russia didn't interfere in the 2016 US elections, and that NATO forced Putin to invade Ukraine, etc. I know some activists who are aware of the online disinformation, but most of the people I know are not. If a media site has progressive information on Palestine, Black Lives Matter, Yemen, the US military, etc., people tend to trust them on their Ukraine, Syria, Russiagate, Nicaragua positions. I don't know how they deal with the cognitive dissonance of seeing news reports that contradict the pro-Putin line. Thousands of hours have been spent arguing what has really happened in Syria, Ukraine, Nicaragua, Russian election interference, etc. Time that could have been spent organizing and building the left has instead been squandered on endless, unnecessary disagreements. I have acquaintances who have backed away from the peace movement because they aren't sure of what is true. Online disinformation has been very destructive to the left. It is a huge problem that needs to be exposed, which is exactly what we're trying to do in this meeting. So with that, I want to switch to Meghan. Thank you for listening, everyone. Linda, thank you for your presentation.
Oh, you're welcome.
Meghan, are you here?
Yep, great, thank you. Linda, do you mind going on mute?
Oh, sure.
Cool, just so we don't have feedback. All right, give me one moment to get the presentation teed up and then we're good to go. Okay. All right, can everyone see my screen? Thumbs up? Okay, great. Okay, today I'm here to talk about fascist ideas on the left and what to do about it. I'm going to go through a lot of this fairly quickly in the interest of time. So please note that this presentation will be available for download after. First, I'm going to frame the long game problem and pose some solutions. In my analysis, our core problem, that our long-term big picture problems are theory, late capitalism, and actual fascism. We see Campism, Stalinism normalized. We have unprincipled socialist and leftist takes. There's big confusion on theory and what is our main task, which is building international working class solidarity. We see capitalist neoliberal think, meaning radical politics have become commodified into a cool decorative aesthetic and an apolitical status. What is essentially bourgeois cosplay, meaning wearing it as a costume, but without the contents. Also, we see fascist values and cultural elements, such as the incredibly common trend of dehumanizing and punching down on people for a laugh. Lastly, we must acknowledge that the far right, actual white supremacist fascism is creeping and it's growing irrespective of what the left is up to. So possible solutions can fall into two categories, public and personal. In our public lives, we have a responsibility to firm up our messaging, lead with values, lead with terms and definitions so our messages are clear, center impact over intention, which I'll talk about more, and make sure we prioritize positive messaging over negative, leading with the aspirational and the central task, which is solidarity building. On the personal front, the role we can play in solving these long game problems is to be doing our own personal work. This includes healing, stepping into our own accountability practice, understanding our role in understanding our role in transformative justice, which includes our day-to-day personal responses to conflict. Also, understanding community care as including ourselves as recipients, not just purveyors of care. We also have a responsibility to learn the definition of white supremacy culture so we can be constantly dismantling the way that it works through us, as well as prioritizing anti-racism work as a lifelong practice. Self-improvement as a political act. Quote, "Change yourself to change the world," said James and Grace Lee Boggs. Lastly, a core solution to the long-term game problem is investing in educating yourself on Black feminist theory and Black feminist organizing traditions. I will talk more about this in a moment. Next, and truly the heart of this talk for me, is framing the right now problem and its possible solutions. Currently, all long game issues are interweaving and expressing themselves online and through culture via various cultural assets, from memes to merchandise. The right now problem involves foreign intervention in leftist spaces through bots, trolls, and paid agents. However, we also have leftist media and orgs that are not paid agents, but are compromised, and they are being blowhorns for the calculated disinfo. These are distinct from unknowing people on the ground, could be any of us, and they're getting swept up in it. And I really urge us to step away from the phrase useful idiots because it's ableist to denigrate anyone's intellectual capacity. And it also participates in punching down when those who are being swept up are overwhelmingly our peers, and they should be comrades and people that we build solidarity with. Next, we have fascism and adjacent values, ideas, characteristics that are in the culture, and we need to be able to clock it or spot it. And luckily, that's fairly easy to see because it's a pretty consistent aesthetic once you look at their sites enough. So what do we do when we see bad takes online? What do we do when we encounter disinfo accounts or when our friends are repeating this information? I'd like to argue today that one of our core solutions to fighting the right now problem and the long game problem is to center Black feminist organizing and recognize that the Black feminist organizing tradition is a roadmap for combating white supremacy in its various mutations. Please note that what follows is not in hierarchical order. I'm more so suggesting multiple channels and that we take kind of a D, all of the above approach. So a core framework that instantly undoes fascist arguments that are hard to perceive sometimes at a glance is the impact over intention framework, which I will get into after this slide. We can also focus on education over constant debate. Another priority is to be proactively building solidarity, doing it tactically, doing it sincerely, intersectionally, which means across race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, and immigration status differences, and doing so with an awareness of nonviolence. There is a nonviolent communications method that we can refer to. Also, leaning into a "we will not cancel us" practice, which is inspired by the Adrienne Marie Brown book, meaning a practice of not being quick to cut ties and cancel people, because that's the status quo. We can instead offer up sustained ties, but with clear boundaries and mutual accountability. And lastly, but in some ways the most important, an anti-fascist priority is to have a vision and having clear messaging around that vision of what our shared future that is post-capitalist is going to look like. What does it consist of? I encourage looking into visionary fiction, including the work of Octavia E. Butler. And it's important that we are dreaming into a liberated future. Excuse me. But we should also be recognizing the ways in which we are actually living liberation or freedom at present. And this is a concept regularly discussed by Adrienne Marie Brown throughout her work, which includes the books Emergent Strategy and Pleasure Activism. Impact over intention is most commonly understood to mean that we center the person or the people impacted directly over ourselves and whatever good intentions we had. This framework is, in my understanding, I would say adjacent to a position articulated by the Black feminist Combahee River Collective in 1977, which is, quote, "We do not believe that the end always justifies the means." So lastly, I would also argue that the impact over intention framework holds up in terms of broader leftist strategy. For example, if we have good intentions about helping Syrians or Ukrainians, but holding one sign on a corner is not making material impact, we should probably pause and reconsider how our energy is being used and be discerning, right? This often shows up in the form of white people starting new organizations when the people directly impacted already have the organizations and have been doing the work for longer. So our discernment must include getting involved in the work that's already being done. And as the kids say, get in where you fit in. In addition to impact over intention as a framework for persistent argument, and also for checking ourselves to make sure that we are in right relationship with the people directly impacted by harm, we can also address the right now problem by prioritizing education over debating ad nauseum online. We should prioritize educating on who are known dishonest sources, naming the propaganda tactic that they're using, and calling their bluff. So, by the way, none of what I'm about to share right now is new information. This is well documented online and very perceivable. So, specific to the context we're in right now, we can very easily say these are individuals that espouse problematic takes. You will also notice that they retweet each other and cross-post. So do get good about paying attention to that if this is new to you. Next, we have media and groups that are transparently Putin aligned. Some may be slightly more covert, but generally openly. So, which is to say, these are groups and media outlets that are giving political cover to fascism. This is an incomplete list, but it gives you a sense because when you look at known Kremlin media, like RT, which is short for Russia Today, Sputnik, Redfish, Dig Deep documentary, which, by the way, is RT was kicked off of YouTube. Dig Deep documentary is RT having a comeback. It is literally RT content, but they have removed the logo and replaced it with this new logo. So you can see for yourself that these other media and groups are almost word for word the same position and talking points. Here are some common talking points on the left-hand side here and why they are red flags. These talking points typically indicate the content you have bumped into is compromised. Please keep in mind this is where discernment and running the content up against an impact over intention analysis is critical. Some big red flags include when the perpetrator is not named, when people talk about war without indicating who is on the offense and who is on the defense. This flattens the power dynamic and flattens the conflict. Another major red flag, and arguably our best tool for parsing both fascist and neoliberal propaganda, is, are they blaming the victim? Or are they centering the voice of the victim or the people impacted? Are they covering for the abuser? Are they defending the perpetrator? So this is basically doing an enabler analysis. Is this source silent on fascist activity, like the Proud Boys or Oath Keepers? Are they silent on the 1-6 committee? I'd also like to flag with a very heavy heart, honestly, is that Russia regularly weaponizes race back at us. We deeply underestimate them. They understand anti-racist arguments very well. So accordingly, we have to have our antennas up for the ways that they are proactively working to get inside or align with groups that are run by Black, Indigenous folks, and people of color. A new tactic on disinfo media is to hire people based on their race or their perceived race, and they have them present on the content that relates to their perceived category, like an Asian American fellow presenting Taiwan disinfo, or an Arab American or Muslim American who's covering Syria. It's a way to give them cover. Race is literally used as a shield. So it's incredibly cynical, it's incredibly sinister, and they've really weaponized the notion of center the people impacted back at us, which is why the other strategy for parsing if you're being manipulated or not is to understand the distinction between principled activism and unprincipled activism. If principles are selectively and not universally applied, that's a red flag. For example, claiming that sanctions against imperialist Russia are illegitimate while on your next social media post calling for BDS, boycott, divest, sanction on Israeli imperialism, that's a red flag. Principled activism understands that A, resistance and self-defense of people under violent physical siege includes, on principle, all means necessary. And B, it is an unprincipled position if you argue sanctioning imperialists is legitimate for some, but then not for others. So principles by definition are universally applicable. So anything that is okay for some, but not okay for others is, again, by definition, exceptionalism. And in our movements, we should want nothing to do with that because exceptionalism is what we already have. It's the unprincipled status quo. So before I dive into a more step-by-step tutorial, I just want to uplift the unmatched clarity of structural analysis found in Black feminist writing and in those organizing in the Black feminist tradition. As Audre Lorde wrote about, she made clear that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. That liberatory strategy, along with the abbreviated list I am providing here, are guide stars for understanding and solving both the right now problem and the long-term problems, including theoretical confusions. And just to note, none of these frameworks are incompatible with Marxist theory, and it is my understanding that most of these are grounded in a Black Marxist understanding. So this next portion draws from the Digital Defenders training from the Women's March that they hosted recently regarding abortion disinfo. Yes, we are totally aware of the critiques of the Women's March, and we still maintain that this Digital Defenders training framework is principled and has global value. So the core objectives of this next portion are getting a shared purpose, avoiding disinformation and ineffective messaging, and uplifting effective messaging online, but also in person. So why are we here and what are we fighting for? We are here to promote an effective, values-based public narrative to win better conditions now and to build the foundation for our collective future. So how do we avoid perpetuating disinfo? Pause before you share. Remind yourself, remind others on social media, and regularly talk about it in person as well. Like, wow, the pro-fascist disinfo has totally ramped up. Have you noticed? It's getting really sophisticated too. We have to be vigilant. Some version of that. So we need to always be thinking before we share anything online. Did you check the source? Did you read the article in entirety? Friends who have been doing this research for years have asked me to convey that if a site or a social media account is consistently excusing Assad or excusing Putin's invasion of Ukraine, they're a disinfo outlet, full stop. You can do search terms on their website and type in Syria to get an instant understanding of if a website is a disinfo outlet or not. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a series of questions. I encourage you to ask those to yourself and also to share this. Encourage others to use this framework before amplifying any information, including memes right now, because so much of the content on the left is being very subtly twisted in defense of fascist actors, specifically Russia, but also Syria and China, who is not fascist, but they're in network. And depending on where you live, the disinfo will focus on more local fascisms. For example, the rampant propaganda for Modi in India, as well as for Marcos in the Philippines. Here are some examples of problematic narratives. This means content or posts on social media that we do not engage with and we do not create. Atrocity denial or victim testimony denial, victim blaming, projections that enable the perpetrator, i.e. Ukrainians are Nazis or Syrians are Al-Qaeda, terrorists. Whataboutism, oppression Olympics, or our suffering justifies it. Not centering those directly impacted, claims of it's a hoax, it's not real, or both sides are the same, which is a very common apps of Democrats in the GOP right now, that if it was sincere might be true, but at this point it's very insincere and strategic to get a certain outcome. Next, if you spot disinfo, don't react. Ignoring is what deflates the algorithm. 2, don't engage directly. Don't like, don't share, don't retweet. Replace with accurate info and stay on message. Be sure to report it as well. So how do we replace with accurate information? What you should do is take a screenshot. You're not going to retweet it, you take a screenshot of the inaccurate info. You can highlight the particularly egregious part, as I have here at the bottom, and then you exit out in red. Please note that, you know, if we do this consistently enough, they're going to get hip to it and they'll probably do the same back at us. But for now, screenshot, name the propaganda technique, replace with accurate info, and stay on message, which is next. So our recipe for effective messaging is accurate, compelling, accessible, and inclusive. Accuracy is the easy part. Compelling, it needs to inspire belief in action. So we do have to think clearly about an emotional hook that conveys shared values. Accessible means conversational language and no jargon, which will be a challenge for anyone who speaks in socialist terms exclusively. But in order to grow, we have to drop the jargon in broad public messaging. It's a priority. Inclusive means, of course, zero discriminatory language, and we will have the most success when we use phrases that indicate us and no matter where we come from. Inclusivity is part of the principled universal positioning that we're taking. This is an example of messaging research done by NARAL Pro-Choice America. This is from the abortion position, right? So this is a model for us, and it indicates the urgency of us knowing our audiences as well as Putin knows his leftist audience. So how do we do this? We rely on pre-existing successful messaging and we modify it based on our specific context. This research is actually readily available through progressive and radical communications groups. So we will include some PDFs in the toolkit we share out. Very quickly, here are some examples of powerful phrases that the Women's March came up with to shift attitudes around abortion in the United States. And they are having success with it. Now, here are some very quick translations of those phrases into the Ukraine solidarity context. Please note that designing powerful phrases is our task. In addition to building solidarity, international solidarity is the goal. How we get there is in large part via the messages. And the better we do messaging, the sooner we get to the end goal. Here is another selection of powerful phrases that focuses on naming the perpetrator, as distinct from the previous slide, which is powerful phrases that center and uplift the people directly impacted. Here is an example framework for how to design messaging within your organizing groups. These are abortion examples here. So this is an educational resource for us to refer to and share out regarding what does it look like to stay on message. This slide shows an educational academy that the Women's March is doing. A lot of what they're covering, as you can see on the left-hand side, is relevant to all justice fights. I share this to underscore that we need to be dedicating members of our networks to ongoing professional development, meaning attending workshops and courses with a tactical focus and especially an anti-fascist focus. And those members communicate back, right? Which is effectively what I'm doing right now because I attended the Digital Defenders workshop and I am now communicating out the learnings and the content from that excellent workshop. I think that we benefit from adopting the framework that the Women's March has put forth, which includes understanding ourselves as digital defenders and having a proactive anti-fascist, disinfo combating role to play in spaces online. I too encourage us to stay curious, stay engaged, and really focus on being strategic. So what's next? You will be added to the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign upcoming events email list. We won't email often, but when we do, it'll be about upcoming talks, new resources, and we will also let you know when something needs intervention. In the next 48 hours, you'll receive a link to this talk and a link to a toolkit with everything we covered today. So if you're interested in going further, please drop your email in the chat directly to John, and we can invite you to our weekly meetings if you'd like to be more involved. So thank you very much for your attention and interest in fascist ideas on the left, what to do about it, and that's my time.
Great. Thank you very much, Megan. Yeah, wow, okay. So the floor is open. Please raise your hand if you know how to do that under the reactions menu. And I'll also be looking in the chat box to see if somebody's put in the word stack, which I now know means I want to speak. Didn't know that until recently. So I don't see any hands raised. Let me check.
They're speechless. Sure.
Yeah, everybody is speechless. Okay. Well, since nobody is got their hand raised, I'm going to read one more short thing, which is from a comment to last week's presentation from someone on the Facebook page who watched the video. I wish the critiques, great stuff, and thanks to the organizers for doing this. One caveat, I wish the critiques of tanky positions, as important as these critiques are, weren't so solely centered on the Western left. The left in the global South has been unimaginably awful on Ukraine, and unlike the West, there are barely any alternative voices or any support for solidarity with Ukrainians and Syrians and other victims of Putin, Assad, etc. Not even the fig leaf of solidarity, just, yeah, Putin. It's a global problem on the left, not a Western problem. And these discourses aren't unconnected. One of the leading figures on the American left is Vijay Prashad, who is also connected to a long-standing Stalinist party and tradition in India, and constantly promotes the BRICS, who in my view are best understood today as a fascist international, as the alternative to US hegemony and the basis for an exciting new multipolar order. There are translations of tanky positions that constantly happen between the Indian and the US Western lefts, and the hegemony of Putinist positions in the first world left contributes to the seamless domination of Putin love among left organizations in the decolonized world. Monsters and fools everywhere, to put it in a nutshell. Okay, managed to get 3 hands raised. Okay, so I have Charles and then Simon and then Stanley. So Charles, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Charles Rackless. I speak on behalf of the International Leninist Trotskyist Tendency and the Communist Workers Group. I didn't find any discussion about organizing the working class against fascism, both in the streets, in the workplace, and in the left, or in that left alliance, brown left alliance. Marxism has a very clear point of view about how to defeat fascism, and it's basically that the working class needs to be mobilized both theoretically and physically for armed self-defense, which means going into the trade unions and advocating, in our point of view, for labor, black and brown self-defense squads to fight off the fascists in the streets and to educate the workers at the workplace. And in the communities of the oppressed, we need to do the same things. And that would be all kinds of organizations of oppressed peoples and among students, and to come together in that battle. Now, on the left, we saw that as our comrades participated or tried to defend the Syrian revolution at an action in New York. Meghan may have been there, where the comrades were attacked by the, I don't know if it was PSL or WWP folks during that book tour. And in that case, we need armed self-defense for the working class advocates of social revolution. Now, just to wrap up, I want to point to points in Meghan's presentation about the struggle being a people's struggle. Well, this is the language of Stalinism moving away from Marxism, which points to the necessity for building the workers' struggle. And in the repurposing of the women's movement statements, it talked about Russia needs a revolution, but there was no mention that Ukraine needs a revolution, that Ukraine is led by a capitalist regime which plays footsie and patsy with the fascists that helped bring it to power despite the election, et cetera. So we need to be very clear and point to where the fascists are. They're not just in Russia, they're also in Ukraine, and that for Ukrainian independence, we're going to have to mobilize the working class in Ukraine, both against the fascist threat there and the capitalist government of Zelensky there, and the Putin imperialist invasion, and for independent working class mobilization and arming of the working class to win a free, independent, and Soviet Ukraine. Thank you.
All right, so I've got Simon and then Stanley and then Luke and then Andrew, John, and Linda. So Simon, go ahead.
Okay, I see there's a lot of people now, so I try to be very brief. First, that comment you read just a second ago was very interesting. I think the author was from India, and it's really interesting to see some perspectives not the non-Western perspectives on the left, but I would also like to add, and in that manner that he was talking about, not to just mention about the Western left, because even in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, sorry, there are some countries and some parties that are really campist in a sense that even you don't even see in US or UK or the Anglophone sphere, or even in France. I would say, like, for example, Bulgaria or Slovakia are most of the political scene is actually really pro-Russian. Even the center left and more radical leftist currents in there as well. So I really agree with this sentence that it is a problem of the left as a whole, not just West. I had an argument with my friend just a few days ago about this West planning. That this this word does this. It's like getting us away from the word campism, because it's getting the with like taking the blame out of the whole left that is actually having a problem all around the world with the with what we're seeing in Ukraine, with what we saw in Syria before. So that's one point. The second, it's a little bit polemic with Meghan, just a slightly polemic, because she said not to engage in discussions with this info. I agree in the sense that we shouldn't discuss with, like, troll spots and stuff. But I had at least a few examples of discussions among the left with, like, organizations that had some kind of a campist attitude, or, like, I would say maybe not campist, but in the sense that they were seeing that both sides are the same and stuff like that. That actually we were able, with the discussions, we could change their position. I would say, like, anti-capitalists in Spain, which are we still have a problem with that, because this group still has, like, some campist articles in their press, but some of the members actually now say that Ukraine should have the right to get weapons. So I think, we should avoid discussions with people who are completely, don't represent anything. We just internet trolls. But I wouldn't be so sure if, like, trying to engage with organizations, even like Jacobin, which published actually, like, the Ukrainian leftist at last, because it didn't do that for months. And I would say the third thing maybe would be interesting for you, because most of you don't have the, like, contact with Europe on a daily basis. So maybe some examples from my continent, or my part of the continent, or with the red-brown alliances, which I see. I don't really know about, like, a group which would say that, yeah, we ally with fascism openly, but at least, like, there is a group of Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany, which is in the Linke, in the main German left radical party, which is awful on Ukraine issue, but it didn't start at that point, because they had, like, a very awful position on immigration as well, because they tried to use leftist language that we are, like, defending the workers' rights and scapegoating against migrants a few years back in Germany.
I mean, you're coming up on 5 minutes. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's
Okay.
enough. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, okay. All right. Sorry about that, but yeah. So Linda, can you mute yourself, please?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I have Stanley, and then Luke, and then Andrew.
a few ideas about what we should be doing in the period ahead, and I just stuck them in the chat. Number one is to get out in the streets, get off of the internet. I mean, this is useful, but I don't know. I think there's a lot of support for Ukraine. It's wide, but it isn't deep, and there should be protests on all, whatever kind of immediate issue we can jump into. And the one that I think is the most important right now is to get the Russian troops out of the Ukrainian power plants. There's a lot of media coverage of the incredible danger by Putin's people actually putting artillery right into the alleyways between the various parts of these power plants, and the reluctance, but not total reluctance, of Ukrainian forces from firing back. Another thing is to open a second front, urge support for Syrians, rush aid to Syrians, the Free Syria, in Idlib, in the Al-Rukban camp, and continue support in Rojava. And that's something, sort of unbelievable, even from the aspect of a US imperialist. Why aren't they doing this? Mostly it has to do with opposition by Israel. But we should critique that. And speaking of critique, follow up what we do, harshly critique the campus, the tanky pacifists, and, have that stuff on websites, point by point, criticizing what they say and linking to facts. And the next thing is pay attention to anarchists. I think most of us, listen to are very favorable to Marxists, Marxist-Leninists, etc. There's some very good thinkers in the anarchist community. A lot of the anti-fascists follow and anarchists. We should be paying attention to them. And finally, keep at it. It's a long slog. I'll tell you what, one small victory. There was a pro-Palestine website that had, the first thing you saw on it was Roger Waters, because he had come to an event and said some very good things. But I finally convinced the people that Waters was horrible on Syria, and they took away that picture. I'm done.
All right, Luke, where are you?
Thanks. Just wanted to share with folks. So some reflections. So yesterday, Caleb Maupin and the Center for Political Innovation were here in Illinois, here in Deerfield, Illinois. And it was a very interesting event. I actually went, and it was attended by some of the guests among Caleb, Tara Reid, who I think has been in the news for her accusations against Joe Biden. The Uhuru People's Movement, a Black nationalist Black Power group, so my reflections out of that are, to what extent do we describe this problem as fascism or nationalism? Because that seems to be the common theme here. Especially, I can't say that the Uhuru People's Movement and the African Socialist Party represents the entirety of the Black nationalist movement in the United States. I'm sure that they don't. But the extent to which most of these folks are brought together under the banner of nationalism. So also at this event, you have support for Hugo Chavez, North Korea, China, so on and so forth. So to what extent is this fascism, or is this kind of the long legacy also of nationalism, and do we draw a distinction? Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay, so I've got Andrew and then John, Ted, and then Brad. So Andrew, go ahead.
Well, thank you for these presentations. I want to just situate myself a bit so what am saying will make sense. I serve on the coordinating committees of United for Peace and Justice, which is a very diverse network of peace groups in the United States. On the Coordinating Committee of Abolition 2000, which is a global network for the elimination of nuclear weapons, and the board of the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms. And the political splits we're talking about here today really are present, so far as I can tell, worldwide, not just in what we would think of as the left in terms of kind of a people in the broader Marxist tradition, but across the anti-war forces, you're seeing the peace and anti-war forces, the old disarmament, the fragments of the old disarmament movements, you're seeing these same splits. You're seeing them in Europe, you're seeing them in India, you're seeing them all kinds of places. And a few of the points made by speakers before, I think I'd really stress in terms of, dealing with these broader contexts that I'm working in. The staying away from the jargon piece is really essential. Internally, we use a lot of the familiar terms because they're shorter and don't require a lot of explanation and so forth, but they often just cause people to turn away in other contexts. I also really want to stress the prevalence of geopolitical thought pretty much across the entire political spectrum. And, just unpacking geopolitical thought in ordinary language terms is a good starting point for a conversation. Getting people to think, what does it mean when we talk of a country as if it was something unitary whose government is presumed to be the legitimate and adequate expression of the will and aspirations of all its people? And it assumes that our government's decisions are ours, and start breaking that down for people. And the other place, particularly in terms of broader movement building and working with the people most directly affected by what we're talking about here is a resurgence of fascism, but really the resurgence of identity-based authoritarian nationalisms worldwide, getting people to think about, why is this happening now? Because that's a route in for bringing political economy back in. But again, I don't talk about it that way either. I say, we have to really start thinking again anew about how does cause and effect work in society now. So thanks again for this discussion, and I'll be coming back and listening to more of them in the future.
Thanks very much, Andrew. It's pretty obvious that I'm using my leeway as a chair to give people a little more time, because I think that people have really valuable things to say. So I'm using my chair's leeway in that position. So I have John, Ted, Brad, and then Brian.
I want to thank Megan and Linda for their introductions. I want to emphasize that the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign is, I guess, what you could call a coalition. And we have some points of unity that we all agree on, but we don't all agree on everything. And I think that's very healthy. And I think that some of the points that Charles Rackless raised about the centrality of the working class and the class orientation are correct. But unless I understood him incorrectly or mistakenly, I think he made a comment, something to the effect of the fascists who brought Zelensky to power. And this is really is nothing but the position that is political cover for Putin. And it's actually factually and historically simply incorrect. And it's the kind of thing that we have to get away from. Meghan made that point, no decisions about us without us. Well, we have to start paying attention to what socialists and other people on the left are saying in Ukraine, because there's none of them, while many, if not all of them, are critical of Zelensky, there's none of them that would say something like that. I thought that Meghan's use of the term the RT left was very, I thought it was an excellent term. And I've known people who were working class left-wing fighters who got drawn into the RT just because of all of its anti-US articles, which some of them are very, very good, and then went right down that rabbit hole. And I think that that term is very descriptive. One thing though, maybe I misunderstood Meghan, Linda, but I don't agree that all Trotskyist groups have been taken in by the RT pro-Putin ideology. Many of them have, most of them have, but I don't think that they all have. Luke mentioned Uhuru, and you see there's been some stuff in the news about them, how they are directly connected with this agent of Putin. And I don't see them as a progressive force at all, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're fascists. And again, we don't all within our group, maybe don't all necessarily agree on how we define fascism. That's okay, you know, but I think that we do have to see a distinction there. I want to say also that we really have to pay attention to this guy, Neville Roy Singham, who is not an agent of Putin. He's an agent of Chinese capitalism. And I hope that Patrick Bond does contribute to this discussion, because Singham has played a major role in South Africa, but not only there, he's playing a role in Brazil and also in India. And he's a very significant figure. Also, he's connected with this Grace Lee Boggs Foundation in Detroit, from what I understand. So just to conclude, you know, last week I really focused on the historical and theoretical roots of these confusions, but since we've been discussing this, I've just been astounded by the number of people and groups that are really just outright agents of Putin, and in some cases actually of fascism. And it's not entirely different from the old Stalinists in the 50s and 60s who had these different liberal front groups, you know, for US-Russia Friendship Committee and all this kind of stuff. But my God, it is really everywhere. So just, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
All right. So I've got Ted, Brad, and then Brian, and I just want to make a note that we do want to allow time for Meghan and Linda to sum up if they would like to, or respond to any comments. I'll give them maybe 5 minutes each at the end. So keep that in mind. It is almost, well, 10:30. So, but I'm happy to go on past 11, or well, it's 11 o'clock here. We don't want to lose people though. So, okay, with that, Ted, go ahead. Oh, and also I'm adding Patrick. Patrick is now in the queue after Brian.
Ted, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Sorry, I was saying Meghan and Linda covered a lot. I would like to speak to many of the things they said, but I'll just say thank you and limit myself to a couple things. I think I completely disagree with Charles, but because the working class is not the trade unions. The working class, the Black feminist Meghan is talking about, are leaders of working class movements. The working class today is not organized in the Third or Fourth or Second or First International. The working class isn't organized in the trade unions either, a small percentages. Most of the working class is outside of that. And that doesn't mean that the class struggle stopped. Black Lives Matter is part of the class struggle. The struggle for women's reproductive rights is part of the class struggle. These are the issues we face, and the right of Ukraine to resist is definitely part of the class struggle. Defeating Russia in Ukraine is the central goal of the working class in Ukraine. And anybody who thinks otherwise doesn't pay attention to reality. This is the bedrock of what we're talking about. There is a split that has developed all over the world between the corrupt old left and the honest new left. The honest new left is confused. It doesn't have an overarching theory. They're mostly not Marxist. They're mostly not anarchist. They're mostly just struggling. This is the nature of the new left. The new left is bigger than the old left, but not well organized or financed. The old left is financed by the two capitalist states, Russia and China, that have long histories of the state bureaucracies in the working class movement of the world. And not just financed, they have huge apparati for developing arguments for their sides. And they disseminate what's developed in the universities of China and Russia through the political parties they influence and finance. I think this is what Linda and Meghan were talking about. And Meghan was talking about the tactics that we can use, that we need to use in fighting these people. They have more money. They have more universities. They have more people with status. We don't. But what we do have is the masses of the world struggling. And they are on our side and we're on their side. So I have some small disagreements with Meghan. And I think that the old left has influence, especially in the third world, where I live. But also in the United States. Look at the fucking DSA, excuse my language. We wrote a letter to DSA. And that letter hasn't been distributed very well, but it has already had a strong impact on the left. We need to pick and choose our fights with the old left. We don't need to fight with Charles because Charles, Charles, doesn't represent anything or anybody. But we do have to fight with the DSA. When the old left does have influence, this is where we don't disengage, we engage. I'm done.
Okay, I've got Brian and then Patrick in South Africa. Brad, Brian, and Patrick.
Okay. Thanks, Linda and Meghan, for your presentations. I'm going to focus in on only one question, which I think has already been raised by Luke and Andrew, which is characterizing the situation that we face within the left and outside of it as using the term fascist or fascism. I've harped on this before, but I consider fascism, I have a very specific definition of the word fascism as a movement organized to smash especially working class organizations and the left, so-called left more generally. What I think we're facing today is a more generic swamp of reactionary ideas, out of which a fascist movement can and is trying to organize itself. You know, for example, I mean, what I know best is the United States, of course. It's here, this is where I am. But if you look at Trumpism, the actual fascist organizations are quite small. They are Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, the various characters that got swept up in the January 6th insurrection. But they are very small groups operating in a much larger swamp of reactionary ideology, which has spread worldwide since, in particular, the dissolution of the Soviet Union and China's turn to a capitalist road. And it's not really surprising that this would be the result of decades of, you know, we could call it Stalinist misleadership, both before and after the death of Stalin. And so this is what we're seeing on the left is the continuing and hopefully dying momentum of these many decades of deliberate misleadership. So I see Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign as not an intervention to develop a mass movement, but an intervention within the left to try to separate the left, and particularly the working class oriented left, from this reactionary swamp. And I'll just say finally that what I call the reactionary swamp has its roots in the mid-19th century. And in fact, our own time resembles the mid-19th century in that sense. It was out of the mid-19th century reactionary ideologies of all sorts that you know, Mussolini and Hitler focused these ideas in the 20s and 30s into their own mass fascist movements. So I'll leave it at that, since other points have been covered pretty well by others. Thanks.
All right, Brian, and then Patrick, and then I'm going to call on myself.
Okay, yeah, I'll be quick and that sort of thing. I really appreciate Megan's presentation. It was terrific. Yeah, and in a nutshell, what it is, you know, at least from my perspective, wearing a lot of hats, it's great marketing, which is really what we're talking about when we're trying to get our ideas across, even though it's not, you know, it's not a revolutionary term, it's a bourgeois term, but it's really good. I mean, because it's about how to make an argument and how to be convincing and how to avoid the negative and how to talk about what we're not, but about what we are. And I think those things are really important. I won't go into much more else, but I'll throw in the chat as I was listening to this. Most of the arguments, most of the structures and stuff are just tools, and whether they're run by working class champions or fascists or whatever, they're just simply tools, and it's how well do you use them and that sort of thing. But people may be familiar with Masterclass, you know, which is a whole bunch of different things. Neil deGrasse Tyson has this series on teaching the objective truth. I would suggest people drop $180, then you can take any Masterclass and look at it, because he talks about how to argue the objective truth. You know, you have bias and then you have objective truth, and it's really good, and it really helps people. I know I've been able to do a lot over the years, whether it's convincing people not to shop at A&P because they handle scab lettuce, to raising millions of dollars for public broadcasting. It all came down to how I presented the message and that sort of thing. And I think that that's really important. So thank you, Megan. I thought that was terrific.
Patrick, are you out there?
I'm Patrick Bond from Johannesburg. I'll be brief. I hope you can hear fine. It's great to be with you, and also the two presentations were very enlightening for me. Thanks. It's weird here because Anthony Blinken is in Johannesburg today, where I am. He's just come from Soweto, where he was at the 1976 uprising. He's tweeting, and really he's here to try to twist the arms of the foreign minister, who's essentially on his side. Her name's Naledi Pandor. She initially called for the Russian troops to withdraw in the first couple of days, but he's also really trying to convince Ramaphosa, the president, that the subsequent position, which was neutrality, has to be changed. And this makes it very, very difficult for us on the left, because in 2013, when Barack Obama visited, which was just after the first BRICS meeting, we had quite a broad protest in Soweto, where I work, the University of Johannesburg, by a broad anti-imperial sort of network. Today we're so weak we couldn't pull off anything. We didn't have much notice, but anyway, there is a bit of an upside, which I'll just conclude with. But because after a very tough couple of weeks, this last couple of days have given me much more optimism. It's partly because this pro-Putin intelligentsia, which certainly is not just a petty bourgeois kind of, commentariat, but it's swaths of the broader population. But they've been influenced by, first, the Communist Party, which claims to have 300,000 members, very inactive, but it's a major, prestigious anti-apartheid force still. It's within our ruling party, the African National Congress, and they're very much pro-Putin. The African National Congress, partly because they got a major contribution from one of Putin's oligarchs here, who has a manganese mine, and he's given a chunk of it to the ANC fundraising arm. But also, more disturbingly, we have a independent left tradition, which for a while included the biggest trade union, the Metal Workers Union, NUMSA, National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. They've just had a terrible meltdown, an awful Congress 2 weeks ago that probably will be declared by the courts null and void because they purged so many leftists. There, as we've already heard, the role of Roy Singham has been powerful. It caused probably the main e-zine associated with this group called New Frame to melt down about 2 months ago. And the problems in NUMSA led to dissidents, and the left dissidents actually came up ahead about 2 months ago in the second main federation of workers, South African Federation of Trade Unions. The main one, about 1.4 million members, is still connected to the ANC. This has about 700,000 members, 300,000 are NUMSA, but the leadership of NUMSA, as I said, came out pro-Putin. What changed the last couple of days is that on Friday, there was a working class summit by the left dissidents, the social movements, the broader SAFTU group, and it was very encouraging. Now, the local conditions are so terrible right now that that's really what people are talking about. We've had all sorts of explosions and implosions and terrible, situations. Perhaps the most relevant that I hope you'll all work on, because nobody's mentioned it yet, is climate. Climate catastrophe is one in which climate denialists within this metalworkers union cite China and its continuing power plant based on coal, and of course gas will be the next one. Just one last point. I mean, I disagree with only one or two tiny things. Megan was talking about sanctions. I think we have a lot more nuance on that, but we can talk about that another day. The final, though, is BRICS, because there is something fascinating about whether the BRICS formation, as Megan or others have said, an international fascism, or maybe somebody else was putting it on the Facebook page, I can't remember. There is actually a critique of the BRICS, not as fascist or inter-imperialist, but actually, if you look at most of the evidence, we've got a sub-imperialist network. The Marxist pedigree for this is Mauro Marini, a Brazilian, but also David Harvey, disclosure, my PhD advisor. Now, the BRICS New Development Bank joined the financial sanctions against Moscow on 4th March to avoid the Western credit rating agencies downgrading them. That happened anyway. Vladimir Putin defaulted on the debt, but he wanted to pay his foreign debt. This makes for an extremely confusing and, let's say, we're not talking about sub-imperialists working very explicitly within the logic of imperialism, but in for Putin, certainly a rogue way. So I'd really welcome that. I had a bit of a debate with Michael Hudson on theanalysis.news, and have written about it at cadtm.org. So if anyone's interested, I'll put my email. But I'd really love us to the deeper ways in which the theories of uneven and combined development at the international level can really tackle this in terms of capital accumulation, class analysis, as well as these really important geopolitical processes. Thanks for all the ways you're contributing to the debate. I'm learning lots, so I'll try and bring it to the comrades here.
Thank you very much, Patrick. So I don't see anybody else that has their hand raised. I feel like we've had a pretty thorough discussion. So, and after I'm done, I want to give Megan and Linda a chance to sum up any comments they'd like to make. I want to thank both of them again for the tremendous, and John as well, for the tremendous amount of work that they put into preparing these presentations. When we first started talking about having these 2 meetings, honestly, I really didn't know what to expect. I felt like I was maybe the main person, you know, in this group that needed to learn this information, because it was this term Red Brown Alliance. I honestly really didn't know what it meant. And I have learned a tremendous amount. And I also feel really overwhelmed by the very stark reality that we face. Although I have ended this meeting today feeling more empowered, if you will, by the presentations, and by the fact that also knowing that we're just opening the door on this topic. There is much, much more to not only discuss, but as was really focused on the work that needs to be done, as Stanley pointed out, in the streets and not just online and with actual people. So yeah, just another sort of reflection on my part, which is, you know, this campaign started in March with just a handful of people. I mean, well, it's still a handful of people, but Olivier, John, Ted, you know, just small group. And I have to say, particularly with the launching of these 2, the videos of the last meeting, I feel that we're reaching people in the world who were sort of giving up. I'm not like patting us on the back, but for me, I feel really moved by the connections that we're making around the world with the European network, with Ukrainians, many other people. And it's giving me hope and inspiration to stay in the fight for the long haul, as we all know is so important. Oh, how did I go on for so long? Okay. All right. So Linda, do you want to do a sum up, and I'll kind of give you about 5 minutes, and then Megan the same?
Yeah, sure. I'm more taken by the question about the international scene, especially in the global South. I've been mostly, well, dealing with the U.S. You know, I know the U.S. left pretty well, and have been for the most part trying to put together what happened to it. You know, during I don't know, like it was like, I guess it was a 2 or 3 year period when I wasn't watching closely enough, and all this stuff went down. I mean, Europe is a little bit different too. We shouldn't probably lump Europe in with the U.S., although I have done that occasionally. But the third world countries, I don't really know what to do, because Putin is capitalizing off of the history of the Soviet Union, which contributed to a lot of national liberation struggles against colonialism and imperialism. And I don't know, I guess we could, I mean, I can't believe all these people don't know what's happening with the Wagner Group in Africa, but you know, both Russia and China have imperial interests in Africa, plus South America. And they also have the fact that we could be facing mass starvation in Africa and the Middle East because of Russia's embargo of Ukrainians' wheat crop, and yet, you know, it just boggles the imagination, at least mine, that you know, these folks don't see that, and maybe they do. Maybe they're going along with it because it's the only way they can get the wheat, is to pretend, you know, is to pretend that they believe. I mean, there's all kinds of unhealthy dynamics going on there, I'm sure. And that's going to be, that's going to be something we can't ignore either for very long, I don't believe. But that was really all I wanted to talk about.
Okay. Megan?
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. Thanks, Linda, for your talk. I put so much energy into preparing my talk. I did not put any energy into closing comments. So I don't really have much, but I totally riffing here. I feel like I hold a role as a translator, like intergenerationally, because I have friends in Gen Z and friends who are, approaching 80 years old. And so I just want to say I'm here to support our movement and, socialism, the whole agenda there, and help us get there. And this has to occur, in my opinion, where the people are hanging out. And to underscore Ted's point, not everybody's in a union. Most of us are online. So I'm here for any complete legitimate discourse. I totally take Patrick's point about sanction, like any of that that's like intellectually honest, I'm here for it. I just want to encourage us to really be aware of like where are we building our alliances? Where do we find people? And yes, in person, if it was 2019, I would be like, absolutely. But I also want to say, as someone who has long COVID, in person is tricky business right now when we are in the middle of a dual pandemic. And that is also an element that the left should be taking up, which is, that's a side conversation, but I just want to mention that is like, if we're going to do that, we also need to be advocating masks and safety for people. So it's not as simple as it used to be, is what I'm suggesting. And yes, some of the unions are pretty reactionary. Yeah, that's also a thing. So anyhow, I just want to say, I think we can do it. I think that clear messaging, us having behind the scenes discussions on clear messaging is part of the way, getting our priorities in order. I showed up here to try to give us tools. My background is in marketing and running a tech company briefly. So there's, anyhow, I want to bring that to the table. And I think we would also benefit from getting to know each other personally, so we understand what each of us brings to the table, and we can, mine our various expertises, because I'm getting a growing awareness of what everybody brings, and that can be part of our strategy. And really getting to know other people in other movements sincerely. I see a lot of, I witness a lot of efforts that are like my stuff, and I see less efforts of what else is going on out there and how do I support other groups who are already doing this. And I already said it, but just want to underscore that point as well, is like, let's get in where there's other stuff going on as well, because they already have a mass. Like maybe we don't have a mass of people if there's 20 of us, but we can get in with other groups that are already highly networked and doing this work. And then we can be those folks who support with theoretical clarifications, right? It's like we can do our own, covert ops in that way to get us more aligned. So I applaud the efforts that everybody is making. Bravo to Stanley for getting them to take down the Roger Waters, like all of these things matter, and we got to keep going. And I believe in us, and I know we can get there.
Okay. I see that Osriel has raised his hand. Osriel, go ahead.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I've been listening, learning a lot, and there is not much time. I just got in, thanks, I got a message from through Patrick. So maybe just 2-3 comments that might come a little bit from completely different angle. So I wanted to start with the fact that Bolsonaro came to meet Putin. Bolsonaro is the closest you could think in Latin America to fascism. Soon, early September, he's planning in the most fascist way 1 million supporters in Sao Paulo, and and he has the paramilitary, he has the militias, and it's important to make a link between Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo. He is working with Bannon, and Steve Bannon has said, and this is coming soon, elections in Brazil are in October, that Brazil is the second country in importance after the United States. So this kind of link, and I will call it fascism, even it doesn't follow a strict definition. I'm talking now from Sweden, from Uppsala. We have soon elections in Sweden, and the fascists, with clear Nazi roots, Swedish Democrats, become normalized. They become legitimized, and they could come if the right wins in that coalition to power in Sweden in the next elections. I don't see the left reacting powerful enough, organized. 40% of LO, the Confederation of Workers, is voting, the preference is with the extreme right. So it's very confusing time in the world and related to this, to Putin's invasion, yeah, and his, yeah, whatever it means right now. And it is true that all links from the left or Russian, Chinese influence in Africa, in Latin America, they're strong, saying, you know, don't pay attention to this Ukrainian nationalists or fascists or even Nazis. That's what the line comes from, the Stalinist, you know, the Chavista language, and so on and so forth. So one topic that I would address is what Steve Bannon, he likes to show. He's saying, I'm doing this. And it's important to listen, because he's saying, we're doing cultural war. The guy has read Gramsci, he has read Sorel, and he's doing the Sorelian, the Gramscian reading for the right. And where are they getting the votes? They're getting the votes from Kuklanish, from the American Nazi Party, for billionaires like Mercer that pays Bannon. And there is something that, listen to this question, is it fascism, is it nationalism? Okay, how did Trump won? It was not a class language. They criminalized Latinos and Mexicans in the same way as Goebbels did with Jews and Gypsies, whatever. So this link between nationalist populism and fascism, and what we have, if we look at the States and Brazil, they have Opus Dei, the right of the Catholic Church, trying to gain votes in the Latino community because of abortion and LGBTG issues. So maybe we need to take into account this element of cultural war. Who are the bedfellows, you know, going along with Trump? These evangelical Christians that in Brazil are clearly connected to narco traffic, for example. Okay, so maybe expand. I don't want to bring confusion, but I would like to bring these few points. And Patrick mentioned this about climate emergency situation, the catastrophe of the climate. In Sweden, there is a new party that is going to focus only on climate and saying, you know, we need to stop global warming, and then 15 points, policy points to address this. one of the members is Gudrun Schiemann, that was with the Left Party, and then was the main behind the feminist initiative. Now she's in this Climate Alliance, it's called. But also the previous Archbishop, missing Swedish with English, Kogehammar. And he's the only one that has brought a point, and he's clearly not Stalinist. But he said one of the main mottos of this ongoing Putin-NATO confrontation is the military-industrial complex. So we should bring this again into our reasoning, because they're clearly feeding into the war machineries and bringing us back to this threat of the nuclear holocaust. And yesterday, we honored the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So maybe I don't know how, but just to put them on the table and then see if we can articulate with, all the good thinking and critical thinking that the group has been doing. So thanks for listening. I hope I didn't take too long time.
I know, Azrael, thank you very much for joining us and for your really valuable point. So I hope that you and Patrick will both come to future meetings, because what you're raising is really important. So I think that we're done, and we don't have any more speakers planned yet, but I know we will. But we certainly have a lot of business to attend to. So I'm expecting, we will plan to meet next Sunday morning at the regular time to go forward with all of the different projects that we have going on. So thanks everyone